situation and on economic perspectives. And we'll also tell you how Russia will act under swiftly changing economic circumstances. 2 years ago, when I addressed the Davos Forum, I said that the monopolar order was ended. It was ended even though there were many attempts to keep it by all means possible. This is a historical, natural movement. Indeed, it is quite difficult to combine cultural and economic variety with a single standard. Now, some standards are being imposed from a single center, but that won't work. And the problem, the issue is that there is a wrong concept. You see, if only strong powers take all the decisions, it won't work. When all decisions are working from one side, when all decisions are going just one way. The U.S. have pronounced their victory during the Cold War, and they saw themselves as missionaries of God on this earth. And they have interests which they see as sacrosanct. But they did not notice that over the last 10 years, throughout the world, new centers, new powerful centers have emerged. And those powerful centers are developing their own institutional and economic growth models. They have a right to defend their national solidarity. So we are talking about natural processes. Those are tectonic changes affecting the world economy and the whole international relations system, where the role of dynamic states with growing perspectives, those are nations we can no longer ignore. And those changes are critical, fundamental, and undeniable. We cannot just sit down and wait for things to go back to their earlier state. This won't happen. But it looks as though some Western national leaders remain focused on their illusions, and they hang on to ideas from the past. They believe that Western domination of the world economic system is eternal. It is not. They are in denial of reality. They're trying to oppose the stream of hope. They are camping on their own illusions. They are deluding themselves that they are the states of what's called the golden billion. And they look at the rest of the world as their colonies, and the people who live in those countries are seen by them as second category human beings. This is what leads to that desire to punish those that don't fit their ranks, that don't want to obey. Also, they contravene their own ethical principles, and they challenge the sovereignty of some nations. For instance, Yugoslavia, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and those are but a few. There are many more. Now, attempts are made to isolate states that go against their opinions. Even their sports, even the Olympic Games, even culture are banned because of where they come from. And this also applies to sanctions against Russia that are unfounded. and that are not sensible. The speed is unbelievable. Those are unprecedented sanctions. So they are trying to devastate the Russian economy. They're trying to strike finances, industry, and the standard of living of Russians. But they won't pull it off. Quite obviously, they won't pull it off. Russian entrepreneurs, Russian power institutions have worked in a unique way. Russian citizens have displayed their unity, and we managed to stabilize the financial markets, banking markets. We reinjected liquidity in the market. We secured the stability of industry, and we secured the safety of working places for workers. So disastrous predictions did not lead anywhere. Now, we understand where those predictions came from. Those predictions regarding the dollar that was supposed to rise, predictions regarding the collapse of our economy. Those were attempts to psychologically pressure business circles. Furthermore, some of our businesses and their leaders did believe those disastrous predictions. However, I would like to underscore once more that we must be honest. We must be realistic when we draw conclusions. We must believe in our own forces. This is quite critical. We are strong. We can face up to any threat. We can solve any challenge. The several-time millenarian history of our country is a proof of that. 3 months have gone by after those unprecedented sanctions were slapped on us. But we managed to lower inflation. We only at 16.7% of inflation. As you know, our economic situation is being stabilized and our finances are stable. I would like to draw some comparisons with other regions. Clearly, you could say 16.7%, that's huge inflation rate from a world point of view, from a global point of view. However, in the current situation, it is not so bad. We had a deficit of 3 billion rubles. But we have now a positive national budgetary situation, and it more than quadrupled the predictions that we had. So this made it possible for us to rebuild and to refound our internal markets. As I said before, we took specific targeted measures to re-inject liquidity into the economic activity of our companies. And all that took place during the second quarter. Currently, national companies have a lot more flexibility to operate during the third quarter. Now, as regards the payment of insurances, they can be delayed, and they can be spread over 12 months starting in June of next year. We also lowered mortgage rates in May, and they are currently at 9%. We extended those low-rate support programs in order to allow Russians to keep on investing. Furthermore, banking interest rates in Russia go on being lower. Our central bank is lowering its interest rate. And I think it should be lowered even once more regarding, I'm talking about the mortgage rate, down to 7%. Now, I wanted to call your attention to a different point. The initiation of programs will last, these programs will last for the same period. And so at the end of this year, we will get somewhere. And the maximum amount of credits is 12 million rubles for Moscow and St. Petersburg, and 10 million rubles for the rest of the country. Clearly, we have drawn on more credits for long-term investments. Among others, we must support the economic structure of our country. We must leave aside state support and to financial institutions. We're going to allocate 120 million rubles to support those programs. And this will enable us to set up new credit lines for new programs, new projects, to the tune of 500 billion rubles. So the economic blitzkrieg against Russia was unsuccessful. As you know, this weapon of sanctions blows to both ways. It goes both ways, and this has been demonstrated during the last few years. This is a double-edged sword which turns against those who use it. We know that among European nation leaders, informally, worrying perspectives are being thrashed out. They say that they're going to set up those sanctions not just against Russia, but also against all of those that fly against their policies, including members of the European Union. They've already threatened their own economies by introducing those sanctions. We've seen how economic and social problems have become worse in the European Union and in the US. We see to what extent the standard of living in Europe is going down. We have made some calculations, and since the early stages of the sanctions, savings in the EU could go up to $400 billion. So that's a direct consequence of sanctions. And so the Europeans will have to pay for this. And inflation in the EU member countries is above 20%. I've given you some figures regarding our inflation, but the inflation rate within the EU, even though they don't have military operations, is higher. And this is the highest inflation rate in the EU for the last 40 years. On the other hand, we have managed to index our wages as well as our pensions in order to make sure that there is at least a minimum standard of living for the poorer sections of our populations. We managed also to support our banking system. Now, we clearly understand that the current situation is difficult. It's difficult for our citizens, and I'd like to thank our citizens because they pulled back a lot of money into banks thanks to those high interest rates. We know that the current rates of inflation eat up a fair amount of the savings of our citizens. We also know that European company losses are very high. We know that the European economy is losing its speed, its growth in a systemic way. and this has been the case for several years. They have systemic, very deep issues, and those issues are going to worsen. I also took this up in Davos. The direct impact of the current European policies will worsen the current breaks in their society, because there are breaks, there are gaps between the different layers of their society. And so currently those contradictions have been hidden. But when we look at the reality of Europe, when we look at the leaders of Europe, the situation is quite incredible, because we are looking at brother parties. In other words, what's being changed is only the participants. But the meaning, the significance of the policies do not change. We can see there's an increase in populism. We see there's a degradation of elites, and this might lead to a real change. Currently, we realize that the new parties are very similar to the former ones. So we can pretend that all is fine, and that's only the price to be paid for their unity. But that's of no use. Currently, the European Union has lost its economic and political sovereignty, all the more so because they try and meet external requirements by threatening their own businesses and their own economies. The current situation, the current difficult economic situation, is not just the results of the last few months. It is not the result of the special military operation that Russia has undertaken in Donbass. So to make such a statement would be a way to displace responsibilities. Actually, the current situation has been created a long time ago. And our world is currently in this situation because of the so-called G7 policies. The G7 accumulated debts over many years, and this has worsened during the corona pandemic in 2020, when demand and supply for services had gone down. What is the role of the special military operation in Donbass in all of this? Well, there is no role. There is no action. All because the leaders of Western nations have started printing money to try and cover the huge deficit they face. Over the last couple of years, the money supply in the U.S. increased by 38%. That amounts to $5.9 billion. There's only a few countries in the world that have a GDP above that figure. The money supply in the EU has also increased hugely, about 20% or more. And I have been hearing noises lately, and you'll forgive me, because I don't like to compliment ourselves, but the Westerners talk about inflation, the so-called Putin inflation. But if you have a head, if you can think for yourself, you will understand what's going on. Because the special military operation in Donbass now has nothing to do with the increase in the prices of energy and foodstuffs. and the like. So this situation is but the consequence of huge management mistakes by leaders in the US and the EU. Clearly, special military operation has had a role to play in that process, but that process had already taken place. What is currently taking place is a threat. Actually, what they're saying, we are not responsible for using those financial resources, and the financial resources that would not manage properly. Now, you may ask, where did those hundreds of million of money that was printed, where did it go? When they were printing money, they didn't think about that. But currently, they realize that they only have very little money left. In 2019, imports to the U.S. was to the amount of $200 billion per month. Currently, it's up to $350 billion. And this increase was to the tune of 40%. So this is more or less the same amount of money that was printed over the last couple of years, and that was spread on the markets of third countries. I would like to add that the U.S. were huge foodstuff suppliers on world market, global markets. They have a long farming tradition, quite exemplary for us as well. That's the way it was, but currently they have changed a lot in a very basic way. Currently, the U.S. have turned into an importer of foodstuffs. They buy foodstuffs throughout the world, and they keep on increasing their imports. But it's even more obvious in the EU countries. They have set off a wave of shortages and inflation over the last couple of years. Almost all foodstuffs, the prices have gone up, not just primary resources, but mostly foodstuffs. Obviously, the US and the EU keep on importing, but the gap between imports and exports has changed. Currently, imports is 13 billion more than exports. In February of this year, the import index of foodstuffs was set at 50%, while the import index of all commodities has more than doubled. So why do you exchange, you keep on trading commodities against euros or dollars that are losing value? So what can be done? This non-unreal economy is going to turn into an economy which is grounded in facts, in reality. Currency currently circulating is losing value by about 8% per year. All the more so that this money can be confiscated or stolen. For instance, if the U.S. don't like something in the policy of another country, they will just deprive that country of that money. You know that several states keep their financial resources in dollars. They are denominated in dollars. So this is only a very objective analysis. You know that in the coming years, we will have a conversion mechanism of existing conversion of existing currencies, and not just Russia, other countries as well. It will relate to foodstuffs, to raw materials, and it will weaken the dollar even more. Now, clearly, the rise in prices and the current policies is lacking in vision. So this will keep on raising the prices of energy sources. So I'd like to repeat what I said. For quite a while, way before the beginning of the special military operation, those prices started to rise. So we shouldn't be accused of being guilty of that. Their policies have also triggered a slowdown in fertilizers, especially nitrogen-based fertilizers, because those prices have gone up by 60% over the last 12 months. Currently, the logistics of fertilizer exports from Russia by Belarus is being blocked, and the situation is increasingly difficult. We don't know where that's going to take us. It might lead to a decrease in the production of foodstuffs, so there will be shortages. Prices will go up even more, and the poorest countries will suffer the most. This is all the responsibility of the US and EU bureaucrats. This is not, once again, because of what transpired a few months ago. It's not because of Russia, as was said by demagogues. It might be pleasant for us to hear that we are so powerful, that we are able to change the situation throughout the world, that we had such power. It might be nice to hear, but that's not the reality. This current situation has been rising over the last few years, and it was created by the lack of vision of those who made decisions within financial institutions to change financial flows, to create even more deficit, and to set off humanitarian disasters in some regions. Once again, this is a rehash of colonial policies, but with a finer definition. Because you cannot really understand what's taking place at first sight, at first blush. But now we must secure the survival of those countries that depend on the production of other countries in order to survive. And Russia can secure enough foodstuffs and contribute those foodstuffs for our internal markets. We can also raise foodstuff exports, and we're going to export to countries that are the most in need of food, where there is a risk of famine. Some countries in Asia and in the Middle East, mostly. Of course, there are difficulties emerging that are not connected with our positions, quite obviously. You know that Americans have introduced sanctions and the EU have implemented them, and the US changed their mind because they understood where that took them. But the Europeans have not understood yet what's going to happen. We understand. That wasn't very smart. But it's difficult for them to reverse, to go back on those. Now, Russia is willing to contribute to the management of the balancing of global markets. We know, we are open to a dialogue with our UN colleagues. When those discussions have taken place, we may be in a position to create favorable conditions to rebalance the economic situation of the world. I have to ask this question of the issue of Ukrainian foodstuff exports to global markets. We are not the ones who set mines in harbors. We are not impeding those exports. On the basis of U.S. calculations, we're talking about 6 billion tons of wheat, 5 billion tons of maize that cannot be exported to global markets. Now, from the viewpoint of global markets, that's not a huge number. And those exports can go through Poland, Belarus, Romania. There are several ways to export those foodstuffs. So once again, this is not our responsibility. This is the responsibility of powers in other countries, and especially in Kiev. So those people have to make decisions in an independent fashion. There's another way out, that wheat could be used as a payment against weapon supplies. That would be very sad indeed. International institutions do not operate correctly, and we certainly cannot make any agreements in these conditions. Now, this decision made by Russia to carry out this special military operation was a difficult one, but it was indispensable. It was a decision by a sovereign country, and it says so in so many words in the UN bylaws, the UN Constitution. Russia wanted to defend its sovereignty. You know that Russians were under threat of genocide for several years. You know that the West kept on building up its military presence in Ukraine. As regards the economic situation of people in the east of Ukraine, they were not interested. But enormous amounts of money were allocated to feed Russophobia and supply weapons. Currently, the defenders of eastern territories in Ukraine are fighting for their rights. The right to say what their future is going to be, and to fight against the pseudo-values that are put down their throat. All the goals of our special military operations will be achieved. And the reason is the courage and the heroic values of our men and of our society that supports our army, our forces, because they understand the historical truth that we support. We want to support and defend the sovereignty of our state. In the 21st century, sovereignty cannot be partial. Sovereignty should be complete, with all its components that are stacked one on top of each other. So we should not just defend our national identity, we should also promote our economic independence. The slapping of Western sanctions was built of the wrong concept that the Russian economy was not sovereign, that it is vulnerable. But that was a huge mistake. They were in love with their own concepts. They believed that the Russian economy was backward, and they did not understand how much Russia has changed over the last few years, how much we have evolved, and how much we worked on building up our macroeconomic security, our food security, how we made headways in terms of financial independence. Clearly, the current situation sets a number of challenges. For instance, the supply of spare parts, logistic chains are broken. At the same time, those challenges triggers new potentials. We often speak of this reality. It is a stimulation, and it is critical in terms of developing our economic potential, scientific and intellectual potential. Clearly, we cannot solve such a complex challenge quickly. We have to work over the long term by implementing the development plans of the economic development plans of our country. We're not changing anything. It's only the ways that we reach those goals that is changed. Now, I would like to touch upon a number of critical points in terms of the development of our country. First, opening. We always aimed for partnerships on an equal basis. As you know, those who are dependent always try to find culprits for their own problems. They depend on their liege lord. You know that Russia will not self-isolate. Russia will keep on looking for partners with all those who are willing to collaborate with us. And we believe that's a majority of the countries in the world. Everyone knows that. I will say nothing new when I remind you that all of those who want to work with Russia are welcome, but they are under open sanctions, sometimes open threats from the US. And sometimes this blackmail is not worth a penny. When real leaders are in charge in countries, because those leaders know where their real interests lie. And Russia will keep on increasing cooperation with those countries. Obviously, we'll keep on cooperating with companies from the West. Even though they are facing all those difficulties, they keep on cooperating with us. We will set up a new platform, a new payment platform that will be independent to increase and facilitate logistic structures. We are developing new logistic corridors. We are building new harbors for shipping purposes, especially in the northern seas as well as the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And this will enable new means of communications with Asian countries in Central Asia and in the Middle East. So I'm not talking just about trade. There are other important issues, such as humanitarian cooperation. Sports and cultural cooperation is also critical in terms of setting up and strengthening those contacts. Second principle of our sustainable development, economic freedoms. Every private initiative will aiming for the development of Russia should be supported. The pandemic showed us that flexibility and economic freedom are critical. You can compete on the world market, by making adjustment with changing realities. We must make sure that the development of the economy is based on private companies. You know that there was a moratorium on the payment vehicles of private companies until 2018. We extended that to 2021. You know that we have still decreased the checks on all private business representatives. But this is on the condition that it doesn't threaten the environment. So increasingly, there is less pressure on private companies. We have decreased taxes 6 times last year. Why? Because of the trust that we have in private companies. They have become even more self-responsible. It shows that Russian companies have become mature. So let's understand that we have still a strong motivation to increase the level of trust vis-à-vis private businesses. And we decided to ban the verification system of all Russian private companies that are not connected with any threat to health. Everyone will understand that we want to plump for an approach which takes risks into account. I want to ask our business leaders to develop programs that will minimize wrongdoing and other infringements. We are currently working on laws, economic laws, and criminal law terms related to economic activities. In the near future, we're going to mitigate laws, lighten up laws on tax infringements. So we must be cautious. But we must prudently decriminalize economic offenses. It is a very sensitive issue. Indeed, we are currently facing illegitimate behavior from our Western partners. And so the upshot is that Russian businesses cannot comply with agreements. But we fully understand that they behave this way because they don't have any other way to do it. There's no other option. We should also think in terms of relaxing sanctions, tax sanctions. Laws should match reality. We have been working on this since 2016, especially as regards inflation. Finally, we must review the time involved in prior detention of economic players. When businessmen are in jail, companies have to stop their businesses, and some people lose their job. And the reputation of businesses is at stake. So I want all the leaders to stop those practices. And I want to ask governments to work with the Supreme Court and hammer out amendments to laws with respect to that. As regards the Security Council, we should also work on criminal cases that have been opened and that were not completed. Some cases have been opened without any foundation. All those cases are used to put pressure on economic players. So we're going to thrash this out more in detail this fall. Undoubtedly, we want the right atmosphere for economic business to take place, and we're going to talk about this during this forum. The Strategic Initiative Agency is constantly monitoring economic players in Russia. Currently, the Moscow area used to be in the 8th rank. It is currently in the 3rd rank. The Tula, Sakhalin, St. Petersburg, Bashkortostan regions have also gone up in the ranking. Also, the Kurgan region went up by 36 ranks, Perm and Altai regions, and Ebosheti up by 36.4%. I would like to thank our colleagues in those regions for their efficient work. Clearly, the federal government will support economic initiatives taken by individuals, especially in remote areas. There are also manufacturing and sales programs of ecological environmental products in the internal market. We must create new possibilities. We must create electronic logistics centers. We must also modernize the postal operations, the operations of the postal system. We must help SMEs and individual entrepreneurs to acquire new competences and skills. We're going to focus on small cities, and we're going to focus on the development of SMEs. I'd like to talk to the leaders of major companies. And dear friends, dear colleagues, our real success is this feeling of dignity and self-respect. But that can be acquired only when you look at the future and the future of our children and the future of our motherland. We will maintain our relations with several company leaders. I know your mindset. On several occasions I heard that you want not just to make benefits, and I agree, because business is about changing life, it's about changing the country, it's about serving society. This is the meaning of life, and this is the meaning of our work. The latest developments only confirmed that it is at home that we feel best. Those who didn't want to hear that have lost thousands, millions, sometimes billions of dollars in the West. They believed that that was a safe haven for their money. There was safe haven for their money, but that was not the case. So I'd like to talk to those who are not here. Do not do not make the same mistakes. We have huge potential. Invest in our country. Invest in the creation of new jobs, the development of infrastructure, support schools, support culture, education, art.
That's Vladimir Putin giving a combative speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. The Russian president argued that the Russian economy has held strong in the face of Western sanctions and that Europe and the U.S. are the ones suffering from their own measures against Russia. He also argued that what he calls the special operation in Ukraine had played no role in the world's current economic situation, including the rise in energy costs. Well, for some analysis on what we've just heard, we can cross to the Latvian capital and speak to our correspondent, Nick Holdsworth. Nick, that was quite a combative speech we just heard from Vladimir Putin. Pretty strong messages there for Western countries.
It's classic Putin. It looks very strong on the surface. It seems combative, as you've just said, and actually it's all projection. It's a house of cards, to tell the truth. He's blaming everything on the West. This is absolutely typical. He starts by talking about one of his favourite subjects, the end of the unipolar world, saying that the US and the West announced victory in the Cold War, but now they're suffering from their arrogance, from trying to call the shots for the last 30 years. He talks about the EU losing its sovereignty and about how Russia attacked Ukraine to protect its sovereignty. Now, it's very interesting that he didn't actually say the special military operation, which is the term the Kremlin uses. It's in Russia, you're not allowed to say it's a war. He said that had been launched in the Donbass to protect the Donbass. So not talking about Ukraine anymore, no mention of Nazis, talking about the heroes of the Russian army and those from the Donbass, from the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, who are protecting Russian values, Russian history, Russian sovereignty. Now, it's all as if those areas of Ukraine where the Russian army and mercenaries fighting for the Russian army, that's as if those areas of Ukraine aren't even Ukrainian, they're part of Russia. So it's part of this old trope that he's been running for a long time. Now, there were some other interesting details here. I mean, he was talking about Russian inflation being 16.7%, and Europe's been 20%, even higher than that, and they're not involved in a special military operation. I had a quick look. The latest figures I could find was that the European inflation figures this year for the EU are projected to be 8%. So where he pulls this 20% out of the air, I don't know. He goes on at some point to talk about easing legal requirements for businesses in Russia who can't meet requirements of Western businesses because of the sanctions, suggesting that they have to do what they can. That looks like a green light for piracy, getting around licenses, basically going completely rogue, also lifting restrictions on business, doing away with cases of economic crimes in Russia. This we have to remember was to a business audience. They were very pleased about this, lots of applause. But basically, as ever, banging on about this is all the West's fault, and not even referring to some of the figures released earlier in the day. The chairman of Sberbank, German Gref, who's a former minister of economics in Russia, is talking about the Russian economy taking 10 years to get back to figures that it achieved last year. So 10 years, 2031, before it can return to anything like the position it's been. Negative growth coming up for years to come. The head of the central bank also saying that the Russian economy is in deep trouble and that the sanctions haven't really yet begun to bite. Now, Putin made some concessions to the fact that Russian businesses can't get spare parts. They're going to have to start making those things themselves, and that could take a while. Well, it could take a very long while. This is typical Putin. It's aimed at an audience. I mean, he referred to there being more friends of Russia than unfriendly nations out there. That may be true. It may be that it's only Europe and the US who are so against what Russia's doing. There's evidence that in Asia and Africa, some of those countries aren't quite so opposed to the Russian war in Ukraine. At the same time, this is a lot of puff. It's Putin looking big, It's the Wizard of Oz. It's the figure behind the curtain. It is classic Putin, but it's a pretty thin tissue really.
Nick Holzer, thank you so much for that look through the thin tissue, debriefing with us Vladimir Putin's speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Thank you very much. It's time for us to take a break here on France 24, but stay with us. We'll have more news coming up for you at the top of the hour.
Fine grains, small in size but with a heavy environmental footprint. Sand is essential to our modern lives, a key material in the construction industry. Its extraction disrupts ecosystems, but demand is unlikely to wane. A crisis may be looming.
Nous sommes sur un site d'extraction de granulats. Le granulat, c'est un panel de différentes roches et de différentes granulométries qui peuvent aller du sable jusqu'aux cailloux et qui vont intégrer les formulations dans le béton ou dans l'utilisation pour des travaux routiers. Nous sommes d'une carrière qui a extrait l'année dernière environ 900 000 tonnes de produits. Pour extraire le tout venant, on creuse le sol, on va venir prendre le matériau directement en place. On va séparer les différents éléments en fonction de leur taille. On va laver ces produits également. On va concasser pour réduire les gros éléments. Lorsque l'on exploite une carrière, on n'exploite pas n'importe comment. On va déterminer les volumes et les zones que l'on va extraire en fonction des différentes années. Et ensuite, cette zone-là sera destinée à être réaménagée par la suite pour être restituée quasiment identique à ce qu'il y avait à l'origine. Donc les matériaux produits sur le site ne voyagent pas énormément, principalement parce que déjà le prix du granulat est déjà relativement bas et le prix de transport vient gréver assez rapidement le prix total. Alors, le granulat est une ressource qui devient de plus en plus rare. Ça devient extrêmement difficile d'ouvrir des carrières ou ne serait-ce même que d'avoir des extensions de carrière, malgré que ce soit un matériau qui est primordial dans la vie de tous les jours. C'est pour ça que l'on voit de plus en plus de recyclage, où on va avoir énormément de matériaux de démolition qui vont revenir sur des sites pour être recyclés pour pouvoir refaire de nouveaux granulats.
Say sand, and you probably picture a holiday on the beach. But more than anything, every single grain is a precious commodity. It's a key component in the manufacturing of glass, computers, but also solar panels and to make concrete. Humans extract 50 billion tons of sand every year from quarries, rivers, but also the ocean. Enough to build a wall 27 meters high by 27 meters wide around the planet. It's become the most exploited resource on Earth after water, and we could soon reach a crisis point. Even though global stocks might seem infinite, we are depleting sand reserves faster than they can be replenished. This as we continue to disregard the crucial role sand plays in keeping ecosystems healthy. More than 1,000